Okay, for those of you who have attended these webinars, should start to become a familiar scene. Maestro 11 with its characteristic dark background. So I wanted to start with some really basic things, just talking about the project facility and the hierarchical project facility in Maestro 11. There's really two places where we're going to be looking at. One is being partially covered in an earlier webinar, and that's the one on the Workspace Navigator, what we call the entry list, which is this area on the top left over here. The entry list and the project table work closely hand in hand. One is not really a replacement for another, but there are different situations we might want to use one and not the other. The project table, on the other hand, is accessible from the window menu up here. It has the shortcut Command T. When I bring that back to my main screen, then you see that it basically shows up pretty much as you would expect. What I'm going to do just really quickly is restart Maestro to actually be the version that I intended. So we're going to look at both the entry list and the project table. And as I said, these are complementary. They work together and they have very similar concepts. As you can see, we've covered in the past that importing is very similar as it was in previous versions. You can simply use the import dialog. Oops. A bit of trouble with my typing. Right, chosen the wrong item. And just to remind you, once we import a structure, we get this very useful banner that tells us that it's been done. That will go away on its own, or we can dismiss it. Okay, so finally, thanks for your patience. Now, there's a really fundamental concept when dealing with both the entry list and the project table that is being brought across from Maestro itself. So long-time Maestro users will be familiar with it, although it sometimes still causes confusion amongst their users. And that is the idea, the difference between selecting an entry and including it. So if, for example, I am at the moment selecting entries, I'm just simply clicking in the row. You can see that in the entry list, and if I show the project table, now the project table, you can see that the selection is shared between the two of them. So we're really looking at the same data in both. I'm just going to close the project table for now, but we'll come back to it in a moment. Selection is really identifying entries in this table that we want to operate on. It doesn't necessarily operate on them immediately, and it doesn't change anything about the workspace usually, but it does allow us to say these are entries that we want to, these are the entries that we want to operate on. A very closely related concept is the idea of inclusion. Inclusion is basically saying, I really now want to look at this particular entry. So if we look at this other group, we see that it has no entry selected, but it has two included. The inclusion icons are shown in blue. This little one with the push pin here, I'll talk about in a moment. So inclusion means that I'm going to change the contents of the workspace. As you can see, when I did that, I got a new ligand in the workspace, and I can keep doing this through the whole list. And of course, there are a number of ways that we can step through the entries automatically. I can, for example, select the ones that I want to look at, and then start simply using the right arrow key to step through them. You can see that they step through as I go. So there are a number of ways that we can look at entries and use the entry list to go through. Now, if I want to look at more than one entry, I can simply either control click So I'm just holding down the Command key or the Control key, depending on your machine, and include multiple entries in there. And just like other type list-based interfaces, if I hold down the Shift key, I can include a range. So that's some useful ways to manipulate the entry list. And everything I've shown here for the entry list, I'll show subsequently also works for the project table. The entry list is really very useful for those situations when you want to have a relatively compact view. In this case, we're really just interested in the titles. We want to step through the structures. We're most interested in the structural information, but we're not particularly interested in all the data that comes along with it. If we want to see all the data, we'll have to go to the project table. I'll show that in a second. Let's go back to this entry here. It has the push pin. This means that it's fixed. So a fixed entry means that normally when I click and it excludes the previous one, but this one remains fixed in the workspace. So a fixed entry is typically, in this case, the receptor. There are a number of ways that I can unfix the entry, but the simplest now, starting with 16.3, is simply just to double click on it. Double click on it, again, will actually double clicking in the inclusion area will fix it. A fixed entry, so along with fixed entries, we have another concept, which is the locked entry. An entry can be both fixed and locked. Once we lock an entry, it makes it non-editable. This has a number of advantages. First of all, we get a notification, but you can see the locked entry here. This is a number of advantages in that we can, for example, just select right over it, and it's not actually selectable. You'll see that the ligand is highlighting as I move over it, but the receptor isn't because it's locked. So locking is a powerful way to control what happens in your workspace. It's a persistent state. It will remain through the entry being, the project being closed and opened again. And it's a way of essentially creating non-editable entries within your project. If you want to unlock, then simply right-click on the selected entry and unlock. Locking and fixing are examples of where the power of being able to select comes into play. If I select these entries, for example, now I can right-click on them, and any of the actions in the right-click menu will apply to all the selected entries. Really nothing to do with what's included in the workspace at this point. This allows us, or the reason people often ask, why do we have inclusion and selection? Well, the reason is that there are times when you may wish to operate on a group of entries without having to have them all in the workspace. And by having the concept of selection, that allows us to. Okay, there's just a couple more things that we might want to talk about before we get to some of the really cool new features within the project table for Maestro 11. One is that if I go ahead now, and as we've seen in previous webinars, once something's selected, then we can operate on it. So now, in this case, I'm just going to very quickly create a surface for it. And what we see once the surface is created is a little S has popped up against the entry which we created a surface for. So this allows us to control the surface, gives us a number of controls. For example, we can just turn it off through there, or we can go to the surface management tools, which are here, and do all the sorts of things that we expect to be able to do, with a surface if we want. We can control its visibility, of course, from here, but we can also, for example, change the if I want to see that as a mesh, then here we go, it's a mesh. So again, that's just a simple left click on this S button. The S button is one of a number of buttons that you may see from time to time. We have similar ones for Jaguar calculated vibrations and for trajectories calculated by molecular dynamics suite. So when you see a button here, it generally means there's some additional information associated with the entry that you may want to have a look at. Okay, so let's start having a look at the idea of, before we go to grouping, let's have a look at a couple of additional things specific to the entry list. One of the nice things about the entry list is it is filterable. So I can, for example, if I click on the little search icon here, I can bring up the filter box, and I can just filter it just to show the entries that have the text string known in it. So known, in this case, I knew that there were a few entries here. So now I'm just showing the filter basically, there's a very small subset of the entries are shown. And if we look down the bottom, we have some information readout. This is a little bit like the status bar that we looked at previous, but it's specific to the currently open project. So we currently have 106 entries, 4 of them are selected, 2 are included. And we have 2 groups at the moment. So now, when I'm sick of that filtering, I can just click to clear the box, and I can click again to get rid of the search field if I want. Generally, as I said earlier, the entry list is used when you're primarily interested in the structures and not so much the properties. But there are ways to add additional property. So I can say, if for example, I'm particularly interested in this case, it might be reasonable for me to be interested, say, in the docking score, since it's this is the result of a docking experiment, then I can bring in the docking score. And you see now that I have an additional column that I can look at just as I go through the entries. There are other ways to do stuff to show this type of information. As we've seen in the past, we have this workspace properties area up here. I can also click on that, and that might be more preferable to say, let's see the docking score up here. Now we have the docking score that will just appear for every entry as I click through them. That information will change. So we have a variety of ways to look at data within the project and within the entry list. Okay, so let's go in and start looking at now one of the cool new features about the Maestro 11 interface. Maestro for a long time has had the concept of groups, and these are really useful. By default, when you read a file, usually a group is created, and you can bring in the related entries. Really helps to organize and declutter your project table. One of the things that people often asked about was the ability to have groups within groups. And with Maestro 11, this facility now is this. For example, I already have these entries selected. Maybe these are things that I don't really want to see all the time, or I want to have some sort of categorization. So I can simply now right-click on those selected entries and say that I want to create a new group. And I'll just call it knowns, in this case. And you can see what's happened is that we now have a group that's within inside this group. So we have the major group here, and we have this group, which is the group of known actors in this particular case. Of course, I could have used any arbitrary subset of entries. Let's say, for example, I want to create another group. Then I can say this one, let's say we mentioned it was the best. So now I've got a group within a group within a group, and this can essentially go on indefinitely. Nothing about the group changes the way the entries behave. They still basically can be brought in and out. I can have any number of entries included within any number of groups. Now, within the group, you can see there's a number here in the in column which shows us how many entries are included. So for the major group, for the outer group, we've got 3 entries included, and there's 2 in the knowns and 1 in the best. So that's useful, especially when you've got the group collapsed, to be able to see how many entries you've actually got included. Once I've created a group, then I can manipulate it in a number of ways. For example, if I decide that this entry really belonged in the best group, I can move it in just like that. So dragging and dropping entries. This is something that certainly is going to work a lot better. Some of you may have tried this in the current version. It's a little primitive. In the current version of Maestro, it's working a lot better, a lot more robustly in the upcoming version coming out in a couple of weeks, the 16.3 release, which should be available during mid to late August. So that's one of the major features of Maestro 11 is this ability within the project table and within the entry list to be able to create groups and to manipulate them. So with that in mind, let's move to the project table. Now, there's a couple of things that are different here to the current version of Maestro that some of you may be familiar with. And one of them, most importantly, is that we now are showing the table in a light color. So you can see that the project table doesn't have the black background that it did in previous versions or the entry list has. This is based on user feedback that people found that with a large amount of data, so when you have large rows of numbers, generally it's easier on the eye to have this in a more natural black on white or dark on light background. So we've gone back to this, although I will show that within the preferences, if you go to the preferences menu, then you can always see the project table theme. You can choose between light and dark themes. So you can, if the dark was something you liked, you can always go back to it. By default, however, we're going to try the light theme for the upcoming updated beta. Now, when we look at the project table, we should see that everything that we did within the entry list is also here now. So all the groups and the subgroups that we created, and all the sort of activities that I showed for the entry list are also possible for the project table. Pretty much we can consider it, as working the same way. I can drag into the project table. I can do all sorts of things that I was doing before. I can include entries, so that basically, now I see a different entry included, and the counts show up here just as they did in the past in the group. One thing we didn't talk about with groups is that groups themselves can be used to select entries. So, for example, if I click here on group, it selects all the entries within there. So if I wanted to operate on all the entries in the group, I can simply select the group header. If I want to operate on all the entries in this group, I can simply select the group header, and I can, of course, rename the group if I want to edit that name relatively simply, and it'll change the name of the group. Okay, so that's pretty much the hierarchical parts of the project table. If I want to ungroup entries, one of the things, obviously I can drag them all out, but I can also right-click on it, and I can just say ungroup. So if I decide that it wasn't very useful having this group called best, I can just ungroup those entries, and they now just appear in place right underneath the group that was encompassing them. So anything that can be grouped can also obviously be ungrouped. Okay, there's a couple more features that I just wanted to talk about that are nice in Maestro 11 and Maestro 11 version of the project table. Before I do that, let me just show you one thing that was actually in earlier versions of Maestro, but often wasn't well understood. If we look up here, there's a button that says tree. So this is the so-called property tree. Property tree is a really good way to manage all your properties. And one of the things that we find with our calculations is that often there's a large amount of data that we might not want to see all of it. So one of the things that property tree does is it gives you kind of a natural, categorized way of being able to turn on and off the various columns that you're going to be seeing. I can, for example, just turn everything off, in which case, I've got no properties, and then I can start back and go and say, well, hey, I really just wanted to see the docking score. So in that case, basically, the docking score should appear. Have a look. Where am I? Bigger. So this allows us to basically control the entries that are visible at any given time. What I might do just to make it a bit clearer, so let's see if we can expand this. So you can see that I can turn on and off the various properties that are in here. What's also really nice about this is that I can do a search within this panel as well. So if I didn't really know where docking score was, I can just type in doc, and you can see that basically that's the only thing that shows up. Turn these basically on and off. We have all sorts of other properties that you might want to turn off, and we've categorized them sort of by family. So for example, we might want to see the date headed. And then the date modified, which is a very useful piece of data in this case. I imported all these entries at the same time, but as you work with the project and you make changes to things, the date modified will change, and so it's often useful. You may want to sort by date modified. sort of things you can do, you've always been able to do in Maestro. You can, for example, if we want to sort by the G-score, I can just sort these selected items, in descending order, for example, or ascending order in this case. So again, a lot of useful things from the column header, including hiding the column. So if I'm sick of this column and don't want to see it anymore, then I can right-click on the column, hide it, and this will update in the task tree as well. Okay, so let's talk about shortcut rows. This is another new feature within Maestro 11 that is, we think, is really going to be really quite useful. One of the problems that people sometimes have is that as they move through large sets of data, there was some entry they wanted to keep track of. They really wanted to keep visible. So we've introduced in the Maestro 11, we've introduced this concept of shortcuts. So again, this is something we're operating on an entry, so I'm first going to select the entry. It doesn't really matter whether it's in the workspace or not, because it happens to be, but it doesn't really matter. And as you can see, I can say add shortcut. What happens now is that we get essentially a second copy of this entry up top here. What that means is that as I progress, you can see as I scroll, that doesn't change. The shortcut rows are at the top, and they are unchanged by scrolling within the table. So what I can do is say if I'm saying in some of these lower scoring ligands, I can start including them in the workspace, but I, at that point, haven't lost track of the receptor. So if I did, for example, wanted to exclude the receptor or do something on the receptor, then it's still up there. So this is kind of a cool feature, and you can have any number of shortcut rows, and if you're sick of seeing the shortcut, then you can just basically right-click on it and say remove shortcut. Puts everything back to normal. Now, no time did anything actually happen to the original entry. So this is a little bit like the concept of frozen rows, as you may see in a spreadsheet, but it's not quite the same. This is why we've called it a shortcut for now, because it is really a quick way of getting back to any specific entry. It will never scroll away. It will always be there available for you. So it's for those times when you have some particular reference entry or something that you want to keep in the table in a fixed place and go back to and have some reliability. But as I said, you can think of it also as like an alias or a shortcut or a duplicate in some ways of this entry. It doesn't actually make two copies. It just is a quick way of getting to this one, and you can always hide it by removing the shortcut at any point in time. Okay, so we've covered many of the new things. I might just show you a couple of other things that are not so well known, that were in Maestro, but are not so well known anyway. One of the things we can do with any entry is we can, with each set of entries, we can start adding some color to our project table. And as you see, we have this color rows. If we wanted to make them, for example, the background to make, say, this color, then we're basically done. So now these rows have this rather slightly unreadable blue background, I can choose any color I want. Maybe I'll experiment with something a bit lighter. This allows you to essentially color the project table any way you want. It just allows for arbitrary coloring, which is really, something that's pretty useful if you are the sort of person that likes to categorize your colors. And if I just go back and choose no coloring, then there's no coloring. Now there was another option here that I will show you, since it's really kind of cool. That is, we can essentially apply a heat map or any arbitrary coloring scheme to a single column. So again, I right-click and I bring up color rows, and this is the idea of coloring by property. So basically now I want to color by E-model. I have the ID model, and once I do that, I get this additional dialog that essentially allows me to set up a number of different color schemes. I can, in this case, by default, it's interpolating because it's assuming that I want some sort of interpolation. I could have a white to red or a white to blue color scheme. And then when we look at the entries, we see that basically, they've been, in this column, they've been colored according to, let me just unselect that, they've been coloured according to their property values. So the most positive ones in this case are the darkest blue. This is really useful for allowing your eye to pick out outliers and so on. It's a really nice feature. It has, as I say, it's been in earlier versions of Maestro, but it's still in Maestro 11, and it's something that I think is well worth looking at. And there are a number of other settings that I won't demonstrate now. But you have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of being able to colour your rows. Now, the one thing that I will point out is we can also then undo that if you're sick of it. But you can always just basically go back and let me just select the whole group, and you can basically say for any of the entries, I can right-click and go back to colour rows, and just basically say that I want no colouring on those. It should put everything back to normal. What I'm going to have to do is uncolour this by property value. Just remove that rule, and then we got rid of the entry list, the colouring by property. So that's an introduction to the hierarchical project table and the new features in the entry list. I hope that that's been useful. We are still making some changes and refinements to the project table, just as we are to all of Maestro 11, but we don't expect that any of the major concepts that we see here will be changing. So whatever you learn now in Maestro 11 will be relevant for the future. Hopefully subsequent versions will just remove a few of the remaining rough edges that we have with all parts of Maestro 11, and we're looking forward to a final release of Maestro 11 at the end of the year, end of 2016. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think we will have time for some questions.